Donna shared her home with her husband, Walter, who had become increasingly domineering despite being a stay-at-home spouse. While Donna worked to support them, Walter managed the household, but his controlling demeanor undermined her efforts. What was meant to be a stable arrangement soon felt like a feudal obligation, with Donna contributing financially but feeling her input was undervalued. One afternoon, Walter smugly announced that he would invite his parents to live with them, suggesting that Donna could move in with her in-laws without bothering to consult her first. Stunned into silence by his audacity, especially since she was the one who owned the house, Donna felt a breaking point approaching. She had endured Walter's overbearing attitude for too long. He often issued commands as if entitled, like the time he ordered her to fetch him ice cream late at night while he lounged comfortably, oblivious to her exhaustion from work. When she suggested he could get it himself, he laughed dismissively, implying that defying him would have consequences. His behavior was not just irritating, it was utterly draining. Donna felt increasingly disrespected and devalued, questioning how sustainable it was to live with someone who believed his role as the husband gave him superiority. If things didn't change, she couldn't continue this way. Walter needed to understand the impact of his actions, and Donna decided it was time for him to face the consequences of his domineering behavior. In that moment, I realized that managing Walter's demands alongside my already stressful job was pushing my limits. "I'm really tired. I'm sorry. I'm going to rest in my room," I told him. Walter didn't take my response well. He blocked my path, challenging me. "What's with that attitude towards your husband? I could kick you out right now if I wanted to. Do you really think it's okay to upset your spouse like this?" His anger baffled me. How could he act so authoritatively without contributing financially, yet be so easily disturbed by my exhaustion? It felt like dealing with a child throwing a tantrum. "I'm sorry, but I'm exhausted. Please try to understand," I replied, forcing a smile and hoping to disengage. He sighed deeply, muttering, "You're such a disappointment as a wife." I didn't have the energy to argue, so I simply repeated, "I'm sorry," before retreating to my room. Each day, Walter's overbearing nature wore me down, but I lacked the energy to confront him. Then, one day, I caught a severe cold, which the doctor diagnosed as stress-induced. My thoughts immediately turned to Walter's relentless pressure. I was so ill that I couldn't move and took a day off work, lying in bed with a fever. When I told Walter about my condition, he snapped, "A cold? That's just an excuse. Go to work. You're useless." His harsh words only seemed to elevate my fever. He declared, "I won't be taking care of you. This is your mess. Deal with it." I was left alone in my room, moaning from the fever with no one to help, too weak to prepare anything for myself. I dreaded facing Walter again, fearing more verbal abuse. My temperature climbed to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fever was so intense that I was drenched in sweat, unable even to change my soaked clothes. Lying there, I pondered how much easier it might be if I could just drift away. With those grim thoughts, I endured a painful night alone. Perhaps it was the fever talking, but deep down, I knew something had to change. Throughout the night, as the sun disappeared and the stars took over the sky, loneliness and doubt engulfed me. I longed for Walter's support, not to cure my fever, but just to bring me an ice pack or check on me. Sadly, that was just a fantasy. Instead, his words echoed in my mind, cutting deep and stirring new anxieties. I questioned why I was the only one suffering, what I had done wrong, and why things couldn't be smoother between us. Once those thoughts surfaced, the tears flowed freely. The pain became unbearable. After 5 days of rest, my fever finally subsided enough for me to return to work. My colleagues and bosses expressed their concern, asking if I was truly okay to be back. Even though I was still recuperating, I felt compelled to support our household financially and couldn't afford to take more time off. Their genuine concern touched me deeply, a stark contrast to Walter's indifference, and nearly brought me to tears again. At that moment, a voice inside me screamed that I could no longer tolerate Walter's behavior. I was pushing myself too hard, ignoring the signs that this lifestyle was unsustainable. Deep down, I knew I couldn't keep going like this without eventually collapsing under the strain. My feelings for Walter had significantly diminished, yet I lacked the energy to consider separation. Amid these turbulent emotions, I trudged through my days, working hard, returning home exhausted, and catering to Walter's unpredictable demands. This had become my new normal. One day, as I sought a moment of peace in my room, Walter called out, asking to discuss something serious. It had been a while since we had a genuine conversation. Typically, Walter made significant decisions on his own. With a heavy heart, I sat down, bracing myself for what was to come. To my shock, he announced with unexpected enthusiasm, "I'm going to let my parents move in with us, and you need to leave since you can't even cook." The first word that escaped my lips was, "What?" He continued, "You have to go because you'll be living with my in-laws." I was stunned, struggling to grasp the selfishness of his demands. The situation had escalated to a breaking point, and I realized that something had to change. As Walter continued, he revealed his plans to change the ownership of our house, intending to transfer it to his name and his parents. He bluntly stated his intention to divorce me, insisting his decision was final and that my opinions didn't matter. I felt utterly disregarded, my feelings trampled beneath choices made without my consent. Walter, inflated by his man-of-the-house ego, seemed solely focused on his desires. My heart sank as I confronted the reality of our life together. Ignoring my growing detachment, Walter sneered, "You love me so much, don't you? I know this is shocking coming from a husband you cherish, but I'm sorry, I just want to take care of my family. Please understand." His words, intended to sound sympathetic, felt more like a reprimand. I wanted to scream that he was mistaken. Any affection I once held for him had evaporated, leaving only disbelief at his selfishness and regret for not leaving sooner. Why hadn't I walked away earlier? If I had, perhaps he wouldn't have had the chance to exploit and demean me so thoroughly. I even found myself resenting my past self for being too lenient. Walter misread my visible distress as lingering love, thinking I couldn't bear the thought of divorce. But he was wrong. My feelings for him had long since faded into nothing more than disdain for a man who wrongly believed I still cared. Determined to reclaim my life, I replied firmly, "Fine then, I'll leave." Walter gasped, clearly caught off guard by my willingness to accept the divorce and move on. He needed to understand that the old me, the one who always bailed him out, was gone for good. From this moment on, whatever happened to him, he would face it alone because our relationship was over. Seeing my resolve, Walter stood frozen in shock. I seized the moment and headed to my room to pack my essentials. I knew I couldn't take larger items today and would need to arrange for movers later. As I began packing, Walter hurried over, perhaps finally grasping the seriousness of the situation. His voice was laced with uncertainty as he approached me. "Are you sure about this? If we divorce, we'll be strangers." I offered a soft smile and replied, "I've already fallen out of love with you. Letting go feels like a weight lifted off my shoulders." Walter stood there, looking bewildered and lost. I nodded, thanked him for the years we shared, and walked out of the house. His worried expression lingered in my mind as I made my way back to my parents' home. When I explained everything to them, they initially reacted with anger at Walter's behavior but soon calmed down. Reassured by my resolve and the plan I had in place, I began to recover at my parents' house, taking the first steps toward initiating the divorce proceedings. After sending the divorce papers, Walter messaged me, "Are you sure about this? I don't know if it's really a good thing, but I don't have any feelings for you anymore. If we've gone this far, there's no turning back." His message ended with a request to expedite the divorce. "I feel so much better now that you're gone, so please fill out the divorce papers quickly." I replied but received no response. A few days later, I received the completed divorce papers from Walter, with his sections already filled out. I promptly finished my part and submitted it to the county office. Just like that, Walter and I were officially divorced. During the proceedings, we divided our assets. Walter insisted on keeping the house, so I transferred ownership to him and chose to move on. The house had never truly felt like home. It was more of a burden. Instead, I sought alimony from Walter, which his parents initially covered since he wasn't working. However, he was now job hunting, likely planning to repay them once he secured employment. But, as often happens, reality didn't align with plans. A month after the divorce was finalized, I had moved out of my parents' home and into a new place, relishing a more peaceful life. Then I received a call from Walter. Honestly, it was annoying. I could guess why he was calling, but ignoring him might lead to complications. Knowing I'd have to address it sooner or later for the sake of my future, I answered with a firm, "Hello, what do you want?" Fed up, I wanted him to get straight to the point. Reluctantly, I listened as he pleaded, "Please help me." His desperate tone made me chuckle. Walter was clearly in a tough spot, and while part of me felt distant, another part was mildly amused by the irony of his desperation. I hadn't expected things to deteriorate so quickly. "What's going on? You need to tell me everything," I replied, half amused by the situation. I suspected why Walter might be struggling, but I wanted him to lay it all out himself. With a hesitant voice and stumbling over his words, Walter began to explain. He had taken over the house after our divorce and managed it fine for a month. However, he now faced a rent payment he couldn't meet due to his unemployment. Desperate, he had asked my former in-laws, who were on a pension, for help, but the rent was far steeper than anyone anticipated, about $2,500, a sum they couldn't afford on their fixed income. My former in-laws were furious, accusing him of misleading them. "This isn't what we agreed to," they insisted, placing the blame squarely on Walter. Feeling lost and nearly in tears, Walter called me. "I didn't realize the rent would be so high. The place is a mess. Now what are you going to do about it?" Frustrated and overwhelmed, He tried to pin the blame on me. I hadn't discussed the specifics of the rent before our separation, but it was his folly to take on the house without understanding the financial commitments involved. He had pushed me away, treating me like an outsider, and now he was facing the consequences of his choices. Despite this, he seemed unable to accept responsibility and was reaching out to me for help. I couldn't help but sigh at his audacity. Ignoring the strain in his voice, Walter continued urgently, "Please, I need your help. We can't keep going like this. I need you." His desperation was palpable. The rent due date had likely already passed, and they might be behind on payments. The landlord of that house had a reputation for being temperamental and strict about rent deadlines. I remembered the warnings I had received while still living there: never be late with the rent. If they missed a payment, they would face serious repercussions. Walter, having met the landlord a few times, knew exactly how intimidating they could be. His call felt like a last-ditch effort fueled by sheer desperation. When Walter called, pleading for help, his tone was as self-centered as ever. "Please, just cover the rent for 1 month. I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right? If someone you care about is in trouble, you should help them out." I wanted to tell him outright that my feelings for him had long since faded, but instead, I bit back my frustration and replied coldly, "I'm sorry, but I have no obligation to help you. You were the one who cut me off, and now you expect me to assist you when it's convenient for you? That's not fair." He attempted to defend himself. "Please don't be so cold. I can't handle this alone. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter now. We were married once, right? Can't you help me just this once?" "No, you left me, and even before that, my feelings for you had already cooled. It's been a long time since I stopped loving you," I stated firmly. Hearing his dejected response, "I can't believe it," hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had endured his selfishness, his indifference, and the way he took me for granted. Even when I was sick, I had stayed by his side, hoping to salvage our marriage, working tirelessly for the life we had built, only to find this was the outcome. Why hadn't I left sooner when my love faded? Why hadn't I distanced myself earlier? Regrets flooded in, mingling with the anger I felt toward him. Walter had never truly faced me, never showed real concern, and never embraced the idea of navigating life as a team. All this time, he had treated me like a maid or a money-making machine, oblivious to my suffering. And now, despite all of this being a result of his choices, he came to me, pleading for help as if he were the victim. His self-centeredness was infuriating. "Please help me, I'm begging you. What about getting married again? Let's start over properly this time. I promise I'll never push you away again," Walter proposed desperately. I felt a mix of incredulity and annoyance. How could he think a simple plea for help could erase the years of neglect and misunderstanding? His desperation was evident, but so was my decision to not fall back into the same toxic pattern. I had moved on, and it was time for him to do the same. I couldn't help but chuckle bitterly at his suggestion. "Are you kidding me? All of this is the result of your actions. I've been trying to find peace for a long time. I kept hoping you would face reality, and now you want me to start over with you, pretending none of it ever happened? Do you expect me to return to those miserable days? That's never going to happen." I was resolute. I would not return to that life. Emotions overwhelmed me, and tears began to flow, though I couldn't tell if they were from anger or sadness. Walter remained silent on the other end, unable to respond to my words, unable to continue the conversation. I simply said goodbye and hung up. He didn't call back, and to ensure I wouldn't hear his voice again, I blocked his number. Later, I learned from mutual friends that Walter and his family had been evicted from their home. He had tried to persuade my former in-laws to cover his rent, but they were furious and refused, further upsetting the landlord. With no options left, they were forced to leave. Walter had struggled to find a full-time job and was now working part-time to make ends meet. Meanwhile, my former in-laws had to sell their house and were now crammed into a rundown apartment, all three of them living together. In contrast, I had been deeply focused on my work, and my boss even discussed a potential promotion with me. I might become the first female manager in our company, and I received admiration from both colleagues and juniors. Occasionally, friends inquired if I was considering marriage again. To be honest, my past experiences left me with a rather negative view of marriage. The idea of dating or marrying again didn't appeal to me at the moment, but life is long, and there's no rush. Many people in this generation live fulfilling lives without marriage. What matters most to me is living without regrets and staying true to myself. With that in mind, I want to continue navigating life at my own pace, embracing whatever comes my way with strength and independence.